When you run away from home at 14, the world doesn't look like the romanticized versions you see in the movies. There's no grand adventure waiting for you, no immediate sense of liberation. Instead, the world shrinks. Your entire existence narrows down to a hyper-focused, agonizing loop of immediate needs. Where am I going to sleep? What am I going to eat? Who is looking at me, and what do they want? You learn very quickly that the streets are not a place of freedom, they are a different kind of prison. You trade the rules of a violent household for the unpredictable, sometimes violent rules of survival. At 14, you were caught in a terrifying liminal space. You were old enough to be out in the world, but entirely unequipped to deal with the predators who seamlessly blend into the shadows of it. After leaving home, I spent my days just trying to move through the world while staying invisible. But invisibility is exhausting. Eventually, you need a roof. You need 4 walls. You need a place where you can close your eyes for more than 10 minutes without keeping one hand wrapped tightly around your bag straps. That desperation led me to the house. I found a place to crash. Calling it a home would be an insult to the word. It was a house, structurally speaking, but functionally it was a revolving door for transients, runaways, and people who had fallen so far off the grid that they no longer remembered what the grid looked like. The house carried a strange energy, a dense, stifling atmosphere created by layers of unspoken pain and fleeting moments of comfort, all mixed with chaotic nightly parties. The walls seemed to absorb the anxiety of everyone who passed through. It smelled perpetually of stale booze, damp wood, and the distinct metallic scent of nervous sweat. People came and went at all hours. Some stayed for a night, some stayed for weeks until they wore out whatever meager welcome they had. There were no leases, no formal arrangements, just a silent, chaotic understanding that if there was empty floor space, you could claim it until someone bigger or crazier decided they wanted it. In an environment like that, you were forced to build rapid, shallow alliances. You gravitate toward familiar faces not out of genuine friendship, but out of a primal need for safety in numbers. That was how I got to know Jeff. Jeff was one of the fixtures of the house. He was older, significantly larger than me, and carried the kind of weary, hardened demeanor of someone who had been navigating this lifestyle for a long time. In the chaotic ecosystem of the transient house, Jeff and I ended up occupying the same orbit. We would cross paths in the dilapidated living room or the overgrown backyard. When you are surrounded by nothing but stress and uncertainty, you look for any opportunity to numb it. Jeff and I would occasionally hang out, finding ways to pass the time and momentarily forget the bleak reality of our situations. We would sit around, sharing whatever we had managed to scrounge up, talking about nothing in particular. In a place devoid of structure, these small moments of shared time felt like a twisted form of normalcy. I let my guard down. It is one of the most dangerous things you can do when you are unhoused, but it's also one of the most human. You cannot live in a state of 100% red alert hypervigilance forever. Eventually, your brain forces you to find a pocket of safety, even if that safety is an illusion. I mistook Jeff's casual presence for friendship. I mistook our shared time for mutual respect. The atmosphere of the house was usually a low, constant hum of noise. Someone was always awake, someone was always moving, someone was always arguing or laughing too loudly. But there was one specific night when the house felt unusually, unsettlingly quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing against your eardrums. Outside, the weather had turned. The sky opened up, and a steady, cold rain began to beat against the single-pane windows. The sound of rain was isolating. It wrapped around the house, cutting it off from the rest of the world. I was exhausted. the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that only comes from days of chronic stress. I had managed to claim a spot in one of the back bedrooms. The room was bare, stripped of anything comforting, but it had a door, and for a 14-year-old runaway, a door is a luxury. I lay down on the floor, using my small bag of belongings as a makeshift pillow. My bag contained my entire world, a few pieces of clothing, some essential hygiene items, and whatever small mementos I had managed to keep hold of. I pulled my jacket tight around me, listening to the rain, desperately trying to let the exhaustion pull me under into sleep. For a few moments, the quiet felt peaceful. I closed my eyes, the tension in my muscles slowly beginning to uncoil. Then the doorknob turned. The sound of the hinges creaking was loud in the silent house. My eyes snapped open, my heart instantly kicking into a frantic, uneven rhythm. The sliver of light from the hallway spilled into the dark room, and a silhouette stepped inside. It was Jeff. My initial reaction wasn't fear, it was annoyance. In the transient house, boundaries were fluid, and people wandering into the wrong room wasn't entirely uncommon. I sat up, clutching my jacket, preparing to tell him he had the wrong room, to tell him I was just trying to sleep. But as he moved further into the room, the dim light caught his face, and the annoyance evaporated, replaced by a cold, paralyzing dread. Jeff was heavily under the influence. It radiated off of him in waves. His eyes were vacant but intently focused, devoid of the casual recognition I was used to seeing. The air in the room seemed to vanish. He wasn't the guy I passed the time with in the living room. He was a stranger, and his intentions were aggressively, violently clear. Before I could even formulate a word, he moved. The speed was shocking. He lunged across the small space, his massive frame blocking the only exit. He strong-armed me. The physical disparity between us was undeniable. I was a 14-year-old kid. He was a fully grown, hardened man fueled by whatever was coursing through his system. He forced me down onto the hard floor, his weight pinning me. The sheer, overwhelming force of it knocked the breath out of my lungs. Panic exploded in my chest. He grabbed at me, his hands rough and forceful, attempting to tear at my clothes. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a wave of ice water. This was happening. There was no one to hear me. The house was dead quiet, and the rain outside would drown out any noise. In that fraction of a second, pinned to the floor of a dark room, my brain went through a lightning-fast sequence of survival calculations. Fight. My instinct screamed at me to thrash, to punch, to scream, but logic, cold and sharp, cut through my panic. I felt the immense weight of him holding me down. If I fought him physically, if I matched his aggression, he would overpower me in seconds. He could hurt me far worse. Or worse than that, he could knock me unconscious. Fighting a man twice my size who was completely out of his mind was a losing battle. If I couldn't outmuscle him, I had to outsmart him. I forced my body to go limp. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Every fiber of my being wanted to fight for my life, but I swallowed the panic. I stopped resisting. I forced my breathing to slow down, portraying a facade of absolute surrender. I pretended to comply. It was a terrifying gamble. It required me to endure a few agonizing moments of utter vulnerability, letting him believe he had won, letting him believe he had complete control. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, feeling sick to my stomach, watching his movements. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I felt the tension in his arms ease. The frantic, violent energy that had fueled his initial attack began to wane as he registered my lack of resistance. He thought I had given up. His guard, just for a fraction of a second, began to lower. I seized the tiny window of opportunity. Keeping my voice as steady and subservient as I could manage, masking the absolute terror vibrating in my throat, I spoke. I need to use the bathroom first." He paused, his cloudy eyes staring down at me, processing the request. The air in the room hung suspended. If he said no, my plan was dead. If he got angry again, I had no backup plan. He grunted, shifting his weight just enough to let me sit up. He agreed, but he wasn't going to let me out of his sight. I stood up on shaking legs. The walk from the bedroom down the short hallway to the bathroom felt like miles. I could feel him right behind me, his presence looming over my shoulder. Every step was calculated. I kept my head down, playing the role of the defeated victim, gathering every ounce of adrenaline pooling in my system. We reached the small, cramped bathroom. It was a filthy, claustrophobic space with a grimy sink, a toilet, and a clawfoot tub pushed against the far wall. I walked in. He stepped in right behind me, moving past me towards the tub in the back. He watched me with predatory patience, waiting. I went through the motions, my mind racing. I needed a distraction. I needed a physical advantage, no matter how small. I finished washing my hands, the water running over my trembling fingers. I reached for the towel, taking a deep breath, mentally preparing my body for the explosion of movement. I turned around. He was standing there, relaxed, arrogant in his presumed control over the situation. He was standing just a little too close to the edge of the tub. I didn't think, I just moved. With every single ounce of strength, terror, and rage I had suppressed over the last 10 minutes, I launched myself at him. I brought both of my hands up and shoved him squarely in the chest with explosive force. The element of surprise was total. He wasn't expecting resistance, let alone an attack. The shove caught him completely off balance. His eyes went wide with shock as his center of gravity shifted backward. He flailed, trying to grab onto me, but his heels caught the lip of the clawfoot tub. With a heavy, echoing crash, he tumbled backward, falling awkwardly into the deep, hard porcelain of the bathtub. I didn't stay to watch him land. The second my hands left his chest, I was already moving. I sprinted. I scrambled out of the bathroom, my bare feet slipping on the cheap linoleum hallway floor. I ran with a kind of speed born only from pure, unadulterated fear. The hallway was dark, but I knew the layout of the house by memory. I knew there was another girl staying in a room at the far end of the hall. We barely knew each other, just two transients existing in the same miserable space, but in that moment, she was my only hope. I reached her door and didn't bother knocking. I hit the wood with my shoulder, bursting into the room. "Help me!" I screamed, the facade of compliance completely shattered, my voice cracking with hysteria. "Help!" The girl startled awake, sitting up in the dim light. In an environment where violence is an ever-present undercurrent, your reflexes adapt. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She took one look at my face, saw the absolute panic, and instantly understood the assignment. From the shadows just beside her makeshift bed, she grabbed a solid wooden baseball bat. Footsteps thundered down the hallway. Jeff had scrambled out of the tub and was coming after me, enraged by the deception. He filled the doorway of the girl's room, his face twisted in fury, ready to finish what he had started. But the dynamic had changed. He wasn't facing a terrified 14-year-old on the floor anymore. He was facing two desperate women, and one of them was armed. As Jeff stepped into the room, the girl swung. She didn't hesitate. She brought the heavy wooden bat down with a vicious whistling arc, aiming for his center mass. Crack! The sound of the wood connecting with him was loud and definitive. He staggered back, roaring in pain and surprise. Before he could recover, she swung again, stepping into the blow, landing another solid hit against his shoulder and ribs. The aggression drained out of him, replaced by shock and the sudden realization that the prey had teeth. He stumbled backward out of the doorway, cursing violently, clutching his side. We didn't wait to see if he would try again. The girl lunged forward, grabbed the doorknob, slammed the door shut, and threw the heavy deadbolt. Click. The sound of that lock sliding into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my life. I collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My entire body was shaking uncontrollably, the adrenaline crash hitting me like a physical blow. The girl stood by the door, the bat still gripped tightly in her hands, her chest rising and falling rapidly. We didn't speak. We just looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement of the horror that had just occurred in the fragile sanctuary we had just secured. The danger wasn't entirely over. Through the thin walls, we could hear Jeff raging in the hallway. He was furious. His ego and his ribs were bruised, and his plans were thwarted. He paced back and forth, slamming his fist against the wall, screaming obscenities. "I'm going to burn it!" he suddenly roared, his voice muffled by the wood of the door but clear enough to understand. "I'm going to burn all your fucking shit!" My heart sank into my stomach. My bag. When I fled the back bedroom, I had left everything behind. My bag was still sitting on the floor where I had been trying to sleep. To anyone else, it was a cheap bag filled with ratty clothes. To a 14-year-old runaway, it was my entire life. It was my armor against the cold, my only clean change of underwear, the few tangible things that tethered me to my humanity. We listened in tense silence as his heavy footsteps stomped down the hall and back into my room. We heard the sound of a window scraping open. "I'm burning it all!" he yelled again, his voice now carrying from the backyard. He had taken my clothes outside. He was going to set them on fire just to spite me, to punish me for surviving. I felt a surge of despair. I was safe from him physically, but losing my only possessions felt like a different kind of violation. It felt like being stripped bare all over again. But then I heard it. The rhythmic, heavy drumming against the roof. The rain. The storm that had started earlier in the evening had not let up. In fact, it had intensified. It was a torrential downpour, the kind of heavy, relentless rain that turns the ground to mud in minutes. Through the cracked window of our barricaded room, we listened. We heard the distinct flick, flick of a cheap lighter struggling to catch. We heard Jeff cursing loudly into the night air. He was trying to ignite a pile of cotton and denim in the middle of a monsoon. He tried for what felt like an eternity. He tore at the clothes, trying to find a dry patch, trying to get a spark to hold. But the sky was relentless. The rain soaked through everything, turning my small pile of belongings into a heavy, wet, fireproof mass. Eventually, the cursing stopped. We heard a loud, frustrated scream of defeat, followed by the heavy thud of the back door slamming shut. Jeff had given up. The house went quiet again, save for the steady, saving sound of the rain. I stayed on the floor of that locked room for the rest of the night. Neither the girl nor I slept a wink. We sat in the dark, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, waiting for the morning light to rescue us. When dawn finally broke, casting a gray, bruised light through the window, the house was silent. The heavy, volatile energy of the night before had dissipated, leaving behind a cold emptiness. I waited a long time before unlocking the door. When I finally crept out into the hallway, the house felt abandoned. Jeff was gone. I walked out the back door and stepped into the muddy, overgrown yard. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a thick, humid chill in the air. In the center of the yard, half buried in the mud and soaking wet, was my poor little pile of clothes. I walked over and knelt in the dirt. I picked through the garments, my hands numb. Some of them were ruined beyond repair, torn during his tantrum or hopelessly stained by the deep mud. But some of them were salvageable. I gathered the heavy, soaking wet clothes into my arms, holding them tight against my chest. I left the house without looking back. I walked up the street a few blocks, carrying the wet bundle, where I knew there was a cheap 24-hour laundromat. It was empty, illuminated by harsh, flickering fluorescent lights. The air inside smelled of bleach and artificial mountain breeze. I loaded the surviving clothes into a rusted washing machine, fed my last few quarters into the slot, and sat down in a molded chair opposite the glass door. I watched the machine fill with water. I watched my clothes get tossed and spun, turning over and over in the suds. As I sat there, the adrenaline completely left my body, leaving me hollowed out and shivering. I thought about the night before. I thought about how close I had come to becoming just another tragic statistic of the streets. I thought about the terrifying reality that my survival wasn't guaranteed by anyone or anything other than my own ability to lie, fight, and run. I had survived Jeff. I had saved a few of my clothes. But as I watched the spin cycle slowly come to a stop, a profound, suffocating reality settled over me. I had my clothes back. I had my life. But as the morning sun fully illuminated the gritty street outside the laundromat, I stared out the window and realized the most terrifying truth of all. I still had absolutely nowhere to go tonight. If you're here with me and you are in a situation that feels impossible to escape, or if you are dealing with the aftermath of trauma, please know that your survival is paramount. You are not to blame for the actions of others, and you do not have to carry the weight of it alone. You can reach the National Runaway Safe Line by calling 1-800-RUNAWAY. That's 1-800-786-2929, or by texting 66008. They provide confidential, non-judgmental support for youth who have run away or are considering it. You can also contact RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, by calling 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Or access their 24/7 online chat at rain.org. They offer free confidential support for survivors of sexual assault. You can also text the word HOME, HOME, to 741-741 from anywhere in the U.S. anytime about any type of crisis. There are people out there who help, and there are people out there who care.